Testing 1, 2, 3. All right, perfect. Okay, and we'll go over to my slides here. And slideshow. All right, and are the slides coming across okay? Perfect. Okay, so cool. Hey everybody. So this is gonna be Level Design 101. This is kind of gonna be a combination of like theory and like best practices from like other level designers in the industry, as well as a lot of my own kind of like subjective, painful learning experiences from occasion. So, yeah. So, who am I? For those of you who don't know me, um, I am some guy that likes to basically make games. I'm an Oculus Launchpad fellow. For those of you that don't know what that is, well, formerly Oculus, now Meta, whatever they're doing, they run an incubator program usually every year. And it's a VR centric thing. And basically, what they do is they take like an open call for applicants, and basically just they look for people who are interested in making VR content, and they help support the making of that VR content. So if you're selected, you get support directly from Oculus, and it's a really cool program. They usually open up applications. Um, the timing has kind of changed a little bit in the past, but from what I've seen lately, it's usually they open up applications sometime in the summer, and the program itself is usually sometime in either late summer or early fall. But either way, it's a really good program. It's a lot of fun. You should apply for it if you have any interest whatsoever in making stuff, especially if that stuff is for VR. I'm also a co-owner and lead designer, developer, wearer of many hats person at a local XR company, Digital Precept. And I kind of touched on the fact that I'm a weird combination of like technical designer, 3D generalist person. I wrangle cats, basically. And I'm self-taught, which has it's cool, but sometimes it's been a little bit of a curse, because when you're self-taught, there's a lot of you don't know what you don't know, and you can only do your own research, and hopefully you're really good at finding good sources, reputable sources, good teachers, stuff like that. So I've done my best to not make this a blind leading the blind talk. I've tried to do a lot of homework. I've actually reached out to a handful of industry level designers for their feedback. So hopefully this is good. I am by no means an expert, but I do feel fairly well versed in the subject. And just a little bit more context. Games that I like: Half-Life, Doom, Elder Scrolls, Zelda, Animal Crossing, Portal. So that might help give you a little bit of insight into like where my head goes when I think about like making levels or making games or something like that. So like those are like the big call outs for me. And this slide is just like a really quick couple of screenshots of things I've done in the past. In the upper left, there's a Portal 2 map that I made a while ago, actually. This was like 2011, 2012, something like that. It's actually freely available on my Steam Workshop, so if you have Portal 2 and you want to go play it, you can go get that from the Steam Workshop for free and play it. I'm really proud of it. I like that map a lot. The upper right-hand part of the screen is my Launchpad project, Mend, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. It is kind of like an asymmetrical puzzle platformer affair. So there's somebody wearing a VR headset who's like really big, and then the second player is this tiny like platforming character, and they have to work together to solve puzzles and just kind of explore and do all sorts of cool stuff. Bottom left and bottom right are both game jams that I've done. Bottom left was, I forget which Ludum Dare it was, but the theme was to combine two incompatible genres. So I mishmashed together basically a Guitar Hero and a walking simulator, and made a game called Modern Art Critic Hero, where you run around and critique art pieces by basically playing Guitar Hero. And it's a very silly, stupid game, but I love it, and it's awesome. And the bottom right is that was a Global Game Jam game, and the theme there was transmission, and we somehow managed to interpret that as like, what if these appliances live in this haunted house and they transmit sounds and it agitates the ghost and blah blah blah. So it was like this kind of like horror thing, and like Five Nights at Freddy's had come out not too long before that, so it was a little jump scary and stuff like that. So anyway, those are just a couple of things that I've done in the past, and or currently working on, like Mend. So yeah. So here's some stuff that I hope you're gonna pick up from this talk. Again, this is the first time I've given it. It might be a little rough around the edges, and I might need to hone some points, but this is what I hope you'll pick up. So again, some of this stuff is going to be really subjective, but I've done my best to kind of like mitigate that and hopefully keep this as objective and useful as possible. You're going to learn what level design is and isn't. Again, I started making levels with the Source Engine tools. And if you're not familiar with that's basically around the time Half-Life 2 came out. So it's like circa 2004, 2005. It was the first game that I found out that like level design tools actually shipped with, or really the entire like development SDK, which is really cool. I hadn't really caught that before. Unfortunately, what got me started making levels with those tools was a small, well, not small, but a mod called Gary's Mod. So if you're unfamiliar with that, it was basically a very sandboxy thing. There wasn't necessarily a goal or a purpose behind the game other than to just like hang out, be silly, and occasionally, just do weird things. So it wasn't very guided, and yeah, I honestly credit a lot of my misadventures to how I started. And we'll get to that in a minute, so hopefully you'll pick up on that. I'm going to cover, getting into the appropriate design mindset for making levels and gameplay, a couple of tips, tricks, and tools, how to get started, where to get started, some very, very helpful references, and to put a cap on everything, hopefully this will be a very high-level design talk. I'm not going to get too into the woods because a lot of these slides could very easily be their own dedicated talk, and I'm trying to keep this relatively contained and short. So yeah, let's get into it. So let's start off with what level design isn't. And this is one of those things that kind of like misguided me when I was first starting out. So if you go to YouTube and you're looking for tutorials or where to start and you type in level design, occasionally some of those search results are going to be people that are like, here's this speed level design that I did over the course of like an hour, and it's like that's really cool, and they'll take this blank project and turn it into this amazing scene, kind of like what you see on the right, and to be clear, that is an amazing skill. That is a work of art on the right. I believe this was done in Unreal Engine, and that looks really good, but it's not level design. As you can see from the comment there, I consider that freeform environment art. And hopefully these next couple of slides will kind of explain why. It has a lot to do with like gameplay and flow, and there is none of that present in this whole speed level design thing. So yeah, not a bad thing. It's not level design. Some more of what level design is not. How do I build this wall? Should the wall even be there? Like, is it stone? Is it concrete? What is this wall's life story? All that stuff. That's what level design isn't. And you're going to have to forgive me, I misspoke. I got ahead of myself. What level design is? It is, should the wall even be there. So in other words, it is the thoughtful use of space within the context of a game's rules and mechanics and stuff like that. So it's Justin, what does that even mean? So it was never really about the wall, and that's honestly what stuck me for so long. I was always focused on, like, making something look like what it was supposed to be, like a wall or a building or whatever. It's really what's inside of those walls that's important, or, the space. It's also about organizing that space to make really fun and engaging gameplay. And honestly, in my opinion, level design is applied game design, and it's where everything comes together. The art, the programming, the project management, the marketing, all of that stuff. Without levels, you have no gameplay, and therefore no game. And I feel like that's something a lot of people miss, especially like at like game jams, or honestly even bigger projects. Like, people get so caught up in the nitty-gritty, or like making a really cool feature, um, or making it really pretty, and it just feels like 9 times out of 10 people end up making basically tech demos or something like that. And it's not necessarily a game. So here are some examples of what I mean when it comes to like actually organizing space. And it turns out the field of architecture is immensely helpful for this. And again, this is another thing I just didn't know. Because for the longest time, I also didn't really understand what architecture was. I basically thought architecture was making these really weird artsy buildings. That's absolutely not what it is. Architecture is effectively how do you make spaces that make sense for the building that you're trying to make, that makes sense for humans to exist in, stuff like that. Um, so architecture and level design really do share a lot of the same like thought processes and skills and stuff like that. So anyway, what this graphic does, it's supposed to demonstrate how basically when you start off making levels or thinking about spaces, you might have a lot of ideas or you might not. You might just dump stuff out onto like a notebook or like a level editor without a whole lot of like thought or regard for like what you're doing. So on the very left part of the graphic, there's a lot of kind of like blobs and not a whole lot of like thought or intent behind the space. It's just kind of like messy and out there. And as the graph moves, or the graphics, go to the right, you'll kind of see how the spaces become more cohesive and I guess more thought out. And again, a lot of this is like practice and where your skill level is for what you're trying to do. But yeah, so when I say like organizing your spaces, this is what I'm talking about. And again, here's kind of like that from my own perspective. And again, this is like one of my eureka moments that I thought was really useful. Hopefully it makes sense to you all. But to me, it was just kind of like, I don't know, a light bulb turned on and all of a sudden it felt like I got it. So, a little context with this image. When I first started, making levels, like I said, it was for some older tools that, Half-Life 2 is made on. The kinds of tools in that level editor, to actually build like level geometry, you had to use primitive shapes like cubes, cylinders, that kind of thing, right? You couldn't just make an object face. Like if you open up Blender, you can make a quad. It only has one side and it's just a square, and on the back there's nothing. That's not true in these old tools. Everything had to be a 3D convex shape. And I kind of attribute that with me getting started off on the wrong foot. That's how I got stuck on this whole concept of should this wall, this wall, what does it look like, blah, blah, blah. I never thought about what was inside of the walls. So if you look at this image I put together really quickly, you'll see that the space that I try to make is, pretend it's a top-down view of a room or something, like an L-shaped room. And you'll notice that it's basically a collection of 6 rectangles to make up the walls, right? It's busy, it's cluttered, there's a lot going on. Again, my focus is on the walls, not what was inside of the walls. And this is the eureka moment that I had. If you just focus on the inside of the walls, things suddenly become a lot easier to think about. You've gone from 6 shapes down to 2, and you still retain, that L-shaped space that you want. So instead of focusing on the barriers, you've focused on what you're allowing the player to do, if that made any sense. So far, so good, y'all? Excellent. Okay. So apparently, in the level design space, that's called massing. So basically, taking your space and kind of throwing it together to see how it shapes up. And I'll a couple of slides, I'll get into the nitty gritty of, how you can actually organize some of this stuff, and, helpful tips and tricks. But it's funny because I wanted to throw this slide in there because even if you are self-taught and you go off and you don't really have any guidance, you can come to a lot of the same conclusions that other people have already come to without even realizing it. And it can be frustrating because it's like, man, had I just, known about this resource earlier, I could have saved myself so much more time and heartache and pain, but, that's life. So, yeah. So let's talk about getting into the appropriate mindset for making levels for a game. Be it like a game jam thing or like a pre-existing game or something like that. What I like to do is stand back and take inventory. It's really important to know what your game is. It's important to understand all the mechanics inside of the game, what makes the game tick, what makes it playable, and all that stuff, and understand the affordances and constraints of the platform. And what I mean by the platform is I'm talking, like PC versus console versus like virtual reality. Because like with VR, it's very immersive, and it's a lot easier to do like negative things for the player, like make them sick or something like that. Because like if you look back when Doom, like the original Doom first came out in like 1993, 4, whatever it was, there are a lot of stories that came out where it's like people were getting motion sick because it was so immersive. So that's just something to be aware of. Not only do you need to know about the game itself and how to play it, but consider the platform as well. Because when you make spaces, again for VR, it's really easy to make a space that feels too big or too small. So there's a lot of like tweaking you have to do. But also with taking inventory, it's really important to understand bugs as well. So I'm assuming most everyone is familiar with Counter-Strike, but you're probably less familiar with the concept of surf maps. So the surf maps were basically these weird pieces of geometry that are like these massive floating slides and basically a void. And the players can like jump on these things and slide around at super fast speeds and do all these crazy acrobatic maneuvers that aren't necessarily inherently part of like the intended Counter-Strike experience. Because the intended Counter-Strike experience is, two teams trying to, they have some objective, and that objective for either team is goes against what the other team is trying to do, and they shoot it out, and blah blah blah. And these surf maps basically take advantage of a bug within the engine that runs Counter-Strike. So, yeah, if you want to make a silly game that takes advantage of or a silly level that takes advantage of bugs, that's absolutely something you can do. It just goes all the way back to knowing the game and having taken that inventory. So once you know the game, it's really important to decide for your level what mechanics you want to use, because that usually determines like the theme of the level or something like that. So if we stick with this idea of Counter-Strike, well, not necessarily Counter-Strike, but like like a generic shooter that Call of Duty 2023, whenever it comes out. So let's say, there's probably like a stealth level. So, okay, the player needs to have access to like a lot of like quiet weapons, or the spaces need to, like maybe there are guards on patrol and you have to sneak around them, or maybe it's a very claustrophobic level and you want to have like a lot of close quarters combat, so you give the player like some kind of like bullet hose, like an SMG or something, and the spaces are really tight and confined. Or maybe it's a sniping level, so you obviously give the player a sniper rifle, and give them like a lot of long distance shooting, so therefore your gameplay spaces have to be a little more wide open and your targets have to be off in the distance, stuff like that. So again, it's really important to understand what you want to do and what mechanics you want to use for your level, and then from there you want to zoom in even more and kind of focus on what the moment-to-moment gameplay is. And when I say moment-to-moment gameplay, that's really your game loop. And what your game loop is, it's basically a piece of your game where you initiate something, the player does it, they finish it, and once they're finished, another game loop starts. So it's just knowing that game loop from A to Z. And I don't know, the game loop could really be anything. Like, player walks into a room, there are enemies in there, they start shooting the enemies. Once all the enemies have been, shot or whatever, player can, get a thing and then exit the room. That is your game loop. And that's like an example of like a combat thing. So yeah. And then it also helps to, think about, the place or the setting of your level, again, at a very, very, very high level. And the idea here is that the setting kind of takes, second place or second seat to your gameplay. It's always gameplay first. So build out your gameplay spaces and then make the theme or the setting fit that gameplay space. And again, these things are kind of informed by what kind of game loop you have. So, again, if you have like really tight claustrophobic spaces that, or like, I don't know, close quarters combat for generic shooter 2023, those kinds of spaces very naturally lend themselves to like apartments or like back alleys or something. So again, gameplay first, setting and art second. And then from there, you know what your game loop is. It's a really good idea to, think about your beats. And basically what that is, a string of game loops one after the other. So it's, it's this game loop first, this game loop second, this game loop third, etc. And you can do a lot of cool things with that and break up your gameplay. And I'll touch on that with a later slide. But not everything. If we're running with this, generic shooter idea, not everything needs to be combat. Because if your game loop and your beats were consistently combat loop, combat loop, combat loop, your player's going to get really fatigued and they're going to get bored just constantly shooting at stuff. So it's really important to break up your gameplay, and that's what beats help you do. There's also this concept of flow, which is essentially how the player moves through your space and moves from space to space. And then finally, it's really, really, really important to not get caught up on how things look. When you're initially building a level, you're going to be throwing things together very quickly, ideally, and doing very quick like solo play tests. Like you build a space, you throw in a little bit of gameplay, you play it really quickly just to make sure it feels right. And when I say feels right, it's like, is this space too big, too small? Are things happening too quickly here? Stuff like that. So it's just very important to have a very iterative approach to doing all this stuff when you first start out, and not get hung up on if it looks good yet, because that comes later in the polish stage. So going back to how architecture is a very useful skill to know, or a very useful field to kind of like research when you're doing level design, there's this concept of party, which basically means it's like the main idea or the spirit of a space. So like an example of that would be like an amphitheater. You go there, you've got a place for the audience. There's a stage to put on a performance or a talk or whatever. Churches, mosques, temples, those are like a religious space with a dedicated purpose of, practicing your religion, something like that. Or like an office space, which is obviously, it's a dedicated space to do work and collaborate. And, this might feel like a really obvious thing, but it's really useful to take this idea, this concept, and think about it within the context of your game loop or your game beats. So it's really, what do I want the player to be doing in this game loop or in this beat or in this level, stuff like that. So, never lose focus from a gameplay perspective of what you want the player to be doing. And generally, I just find that helpful to, keep me focused on what I'm doing and trying to implement whenever I'm working on levels. So here's some more thoughts on game loop. There's a really famous quote in the Halo 2 making of video documentary that Bungie pushed out after the release of the game. And the designer that said this was Jamie Grassimere. Sorry if I got that name wrong, Jamie. If you ever see this, you probably won't. But this is his interpretation of game loop, which was actually misquoted because there was an entire second half of this quote that they cut out of the video. And yeah, but whoop, I went ahead. How do we go back? Give me 1 second. Oh, buddy, hold up. Technical difficulties. One moment. There we go. All right, sorry about that, y'all. So yeah, but basically this quote is his interpretation of the game loop. He says, in Halo, there's maybe this 30 seconds of fun, and that 30 seconds happens over and over and over again, and if you can't get that 30 seconds to stretch out, you've got a game. And that is where the video left off. The part that they cut out was him saying you have to vary that up. You never want to have the same loop over and over and over again, because again, the player might get bored, they might get fatigued doing the same thing over and over again. So yeah, it's really important to find a way to spice up your gameplay. And this is kind of how you do that. So you use your game beats. So it's your game loop kind of on repeat, but not really. So an example of this, I don't know how many of you have played Half-Life Alyx, but all of Valve's games, like their single-player games, they do a really good job of varying up the game loop. Because, there might be a puzzle section or an exploration section followed up by a combat section, and then, like a cool-off period to, let the player kind of like come down from, the stress of fighting and stuff like that. And this is actually a very common pattern that you'll see in other games. So it's like, maybe that puzzle is you have to, I don't know, open a door to get to the next area, but the door is locked or something, so you have to go off and find a key. Once you found the key, you can bring it back to the door, open the door, and then it opens up this wide open area, but all of a sudden there are like a lot of health kits scattered around, so it's like, oh no, there's a fight coming up, and then you do something to initiate that fight, which kicks off the combat loop, and then you finish the fight, and all that, blah, 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 and then you hit the cool-off period. So, when you're playing your games, and when you know what you're looking for, it's very easy to kind of like isolate which beats are what, and how it was strung together. Yeah. So when it comes to actually building your spaces and, kind of making them, organizing them in a thought-out manner, it's important to think about how you want the player to move through this space, and just making that as easy as possible. In this image that I have linked below, you'll notice in each image there are two lines. You've got the red line and the yellow line. What the yellow line is the player's desired destination. It's like, oh, I want to go there, but how do I get there? And the image on the left, you'll see the red line. That red line is the path that the player has to take. That flow is not good. There are two basically 180-degree turns back to back. So the player is, having to like look around and, move around in these very drastically different directions. And generally it's not a good experience. It can make your level feel, kind of like cluttered, or kind of like thrown together very haphazardly. The flow on the right is much better, because instead of 280-degree turns, you see that the stairs have been reorganized to turn that into only one 90-degree turn, which is much better when it comes to flow and like keeping an important destination maybe in the player's line of sight, or maybe not even a destination, but just like an interesting thing within the player's line of sight. So, yeah. So here are some tips, tricks, and tools. So planning is immensely important. Again, this goes back to the idea of, staying focused on what you want the player to be doing from moment to moment, or the idea of party, what the idea of a space is supposed to be. So, it's really important to just like know your level, have taken inventory, have a rough idea of, what you want your beats to be and your flow to be, and then start thinking about spaces and like what game mechanics you want to use, and then just start sketching it out, or, maybe like roughly blocking it out in a level editor. But just stay focused on building everything out from start to finish. It's like you'll notice these sketches they're rough, but, they detail, in the big moments, or the big takeaways from your level. And you don't even have to go that far. Like this bubble diagram over here on the right, like it's obviously a house, but they didn't go as far as to, actually, get graph paper and, actually build out how big this space was going to be on the graph paper and blah, blah, blah. It's really just a bubble diagram that shows, how each room is connected to the other, and how the player might, flow through this house or this space. And you'll notice, it's labeled. So again, there's that idea of party. What is the idea of this space? How can I make a front porch interesting within the context of the game? Again, maybe it is like a puzzle loop or something like that. So you can find a way to get into the living room, which might be like a combat space or something else. I don't know. Just something like that. Gates. So gates are a way to keep the player confined, and you see this all over the place. With the original Doom, this took the form of key cards and locked doors, literally gates. So the player had to, fight their way through this infested space base on Mars to find a key to go back to a place to unlock a door. That door is a gate. And gates can be, one way or bidirectional. An example of that would be over on the right. So that's a screenshot from The Last of Us. And this is actually a really common reoccurring game mechanic where the player could pick up ladders. Basically, the ladders were a way of unlocking that gate. The gate being, a ledge that was too high for the player to get to, and the ladder, afforded them the ability to climb up onto the ledge and keep going through the level. But that's a bidirectional gate, because once you're on top of that crate, you can still jump back down to where you came from. An example of a one-way gate might be the other way around. So maybe, let's say, you're progressing through your level and there's a cliff face. And, maybe if you jump down this cliff face and you're supposed to go that way, it's too tall for the player to backtrack once they've gotten to the bottom of that cliff. So that's an example of a one-directional gate. And you might notice, when you're playing a game, that when you do something like that, the game might auto-save or something like that. So it's a way to, kind of keep the player moving forward and just kind of guide them a little bit to prevent them from backtracking a little bit or getting lost or something like that. This is one of those slides where I tried to find an image and I just ran out of time. But there's this idea of signposting, which could be literally a signpost, or I don't know, maybe you've given the player a goal of turning on a generator or something, and maybe there's writing on the I don't know, like another sign that says danger high voltage that kind of like clues the player into, oh, the generator might be close to here, or something like that. So again, it's just another way to kind of keep the player or guide the player a little bit. And you could do other really cool things. There's one kind of signposting technique I like to use called breadcrumbing, where, say you're playing a collectathon. I guess take Banjo-Kazooie, for example. You have like notes, which are collectible within each level, and they're scattered around. So if you can kind of like drop notes towards a goal, that's another way to catch the player's attention and kind of guide them to an area that you want them to go in, because they see those collectibles and they want to go and collect them, and they follow this trail of collectibles into another area. So that's an example of signposting called breadcrumbing. I love it. It's my favorite. Oh, I actually did find an example. So yeah, again, literal signposts, and this is from Morrowind. So again, just literal signposts that live in your level that help guide the player or keep them oriented. And you can take the same concept and blow it up. So this is called landmarking. And again, it could be a literal landmark like a mountain or a building. And it can be purely visual, or it could be, a goal. So an example of, well, here, let me go to the next slide. So this screenshot, this is from an Overwatch level that was in the blockout phase. This tower here, kind of like off-centered in the center of the map, that would be a landmark. Because it's a very big thing, and usually wherever the player is in this level, they can see that tower and then get a rough idea of where they are spatially relative to that tower, and therefore help them know where they might want to go to fight the other team, or something like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry, come again? Oh, I'm honestly not sure. I didn't have time to credit the image on that. I need to go back and do that. I believe that map was used in the game. That GIF was actually supposed to be like a blockout and Final Art Pass comparison. I just took the image of the tower just to kind of convey the point of the signpost, or the landmarking. But yeah, I believe it was put into the game. I just don't know which level it is, so sorry. um, so yeah, giving the player choices. So there's this idea of critical path, which basically is if the player does nothing else, they must go through this path. There's no other choice. This is it. And you can have paths that like branch off from that and do other things. An example of that would be like Super Mario World. So there were some levels that you get from point A to point B, and then you go on to the next level. But if you go back and you replay that level and you pay special attention, you'll see like a hidden path that you didn't catch before. Or maybe it was gated until you had some certain ability, and you have to come back to ungate that with a set ability. And then you can go down the optional path, where I don't know, there might be a secret ending or something, or a secret exit or something like that. So Super Mario World is really famous for that because if you got to enough secret endings, you could get to like Rainbow Road, and there were these wacky levels that you could play that were also really hard. So that's really important concept. So here's kind of like a visual demonstration of what I mean by critical path. If you look at this image, you'll notice that some of these areas have been kind of like grayed out, ghosted out a little bit, and those are basically, quote, optional areas. So there might be really important gameplay things there, like I don't know, maybe you could like sprinkle in some health kits or just like some stuff that isn't necessarily required to exit out of this area. So anything like that is considered to be off the critical path. This critical path, again, is literally what the player must do to get through your gameplay sequence. There's no question around that. So. And I'm terribly sorry, this slide is really long, but I'll try and condense it down. What has helped me is to think of my space or my gameplay mechanics as a currency. And this kind of goes back to, giving the player interesting choices. So if you think about it, again, I don't know, in the context of like a competitive shooter, moving through space is a cost. The player has to choose to be at a certain spot at a certain point in time, and to do that, they have to move from point A to point B. That is a cost. They have committed to being in that point B, right? And like, I don't know, maybe if you look at a kind of like a single-player shooter, if it's very story-driven, you've got enemies in the area, obviously, and, maybe you're getting shot at. The player's health is also a currency. So, a way of, building in an interesting choice for the player in that situation would be to, maybe there's, I don't know, a really boring, easy path that doesn't have a whole lot of enemies, and it will just simply get you from point A to point B, but maybe there's this, path that, is a little less traveled, and there's something really cool, but to get to it, the player's going to have to fight through a horde of enemies, and to do that, they're going to have, have a lot of health, and be very careful about how they, quote, spend their health points. And, that kind of concept is called carroting, where you show the player something really cool, but to get to it, they're going to have to pay some cost. That's how you make it interesting. And you see this all the time in multiplayer maps. Like with Halo, occasionally, halfway through a match, maybe on the high ground, the announcer would be like, oh, there's a power weapon incoming. And all of a sudden, everyone is fighting over this power weapon, and they're choosing to spend their currency to move through space, to spend their currency of ammo and health to fight over this really cool thing that they want. And alternatively, you can have some players that choose not to do that and, pick off the other players from a distance. So, again, it's thinking of things like that. Thinking of things like a currency has helped me build interesting choices for my players. So, think of ways that, maybe they can bank that currency, spend that currency. And again, this goes back to knowing your game, knowing your mechanics, because if you know your mechanics, you know what the player has to spend, and you can give them cool ways to spend that. So yeah, environment art. This is something that you would usually tackle near the final stages of building a level. Usually when you build a level, you do all of the pre-planning, you have an idea for what you want to build, you block it out, you script it, you play test it, you get, most of the rough bugs out, and then once your level is playable and everything that you want to do is there, then you go back and you start doing the art pass and you make things looking like the space that you want the player to think they're in. It's really environment art. Yeah, excuse me. Environment art is really a facade. It's basically an illusion to trick the player into thinking they're in a certain space because it looks like a certain space. They think they're in a space station because it looks like a space station. They think they're in some temple ruins because it looks like temple ruins. All of the gameplay and all of the mechanics have already been built and put into that space, and now you're putting on the coat of paint. And here's some examples. They're not the best examples, but again, I ran out of time, so I'll have to, do a second pass on this whole talk. But anyway, here's an example of kind of like environment art and dressing a scene up to make it look like something. So I've taken this video from, again, Counter-Strike. I'm sorry, I like Counter-Strike a lot. I promise I play more games other than just shooters. But you'll see kind of what I'm talking about here. The gameplay spacers are there, and the area is dressed up to look like, I don't know, this small villa in, like, Italy. But if you look closely, the illusion can fall apart because... Let's mute this. You'll see... Let's see if I can up the resolution on this video just a touch. Here we go. So you'll see here in the distance, there's this window on the outside of this building, right? It's really tall and skinny. But as soon as the player enters this area, the window is all of a sudden huge. It's still like a double-paned window, but it's much bigger than it is on the outside. Yes, the window is in the right place, but logically it doesn't make sense. But it was dressed up to look like a window, and I promise you when players are playing this game, they're focused on playing the objective and leaning into their game mechanics and fighting the enemy, they are not going to notice that those windows are not the same size and it doesn't make sense. So that's kind of how environment art... That's really the purpose of environment art. This looks like what you think this place should look like, and that's about it. Again, I don't mean to diminish the value of environment art because it is really important to have good artists, because if your level looks really for lack of a better description bad you're gonna have a harder time selling that this space is what it is. So don't get me wrong, environment art is incredibly important, but it's not the be all end all. Let's see, if I just finish this video, I think I just give like another angle to make the... Yeah, so here we go. So here I'm just cheating. I'm flying through the level. Here's a close-up of that window that I was talking about on the outside. Again, it's very tall and skinny, but as soon as I fly through, the window is just, again, massive. So... just purely set dressing. There's no gameplay purpose of that window. Honestly, it's probably just there to visually break up that building, because if you notice, on all right, so that building has two walls. There's a wall on the left and a wall on the right. The wall on the left, there's a doorway. Or it's like, all right, that's cool. There's a texture on it that kind of like breaks up that space to the right of the door on the wall. So it just breaks things up visually, I guess. I'm not an artist, so you'll have to forgive me for the the awful description there. But on the right side, again, that window doesn't serve a gameplay purpose. It's just there as set dressing, as a facade, to make that building look like a building with a window, basically. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah. I'll actually get into that, because, like, again, I ran out of time, and I wanted to do this whole thing on lighting, which could really be its own talk. But again, I'm not an artist, so I'm not really much of an authority to, like, talk about art. And again, I'm not trying to trash artists or, like, environment art here, because, like, again, it's really important. It's just like, I don't know. Environment art isn't level design, is basically what I'm trying to say. Okay, let's see if I can. Boop. Okay, I love this example. Here is the window example on steroids, and this is from Overwatch. So you'll see that look at the outside of this building, right? It's beautiful. You can see into the window, see through the windows. You can see into the room. You know, it's this very inviting scene. It looks really cool, but if you look too closely, looking through the window, it's really cool. Blah blah blah. But if you look too closely, it's a one-sided window. Here we go. So again, that's just how the whole point of environment art is to sell the idea of place or setting or theme. And if you look too closely, it can fall apart. It looks really good though. It's just I love this example of one-way window where you can see into this room and there's nothing on the other side. It's a one-way window that makes no sense. Okay, I want to go to my next slide. There we go. Okay, so here is a brief section on lighting. Again, this is a topic that I really wanted to spend a lot more time on, and this whole section could be its own talk. But there are a couple of really useful tricks from a level design perspective that you can use to help the player with flow and pointing out areas where they should go. So this image, if you look on the left, there is an early block out, and if you look on the right, there is a finished level. Well, a more finished level. It's full of environment art and stuff like that. And again, if you notice, the gameplay space here, nothing has changed, but that, orange crate that says 64 by 64 has suddenly turned into like some old oil drums and a wood pallet on the side. So, that's just helping sell the idea of this space while maintaining the intended purpose behind the space. So, the flow is still there, the breaking it up is still there, stuff like that. So anyway, you'll notice in the blockout there is lighting though. So this door on the left, where with the three guys standing by it, it's really bright. So naturally that catches the player's attention, and they want to go to that door. Again, in the center area, there's a door that has a light, behind it, and there's a lot of heavy contrast between that doorway and then the very poorly lit wall right next to it. And again, that just catches the player's attention. And you can see how that was translated over into the final environment art. What I'm betting that you didn't notice was that there is some scaffolding on the second story of both the blockout and the final art, where there is a playable space, but it's poorly lit and it did not catch your attention. And you can see how that's remedied. So here in this next slide, again, the same tricks of lighting up spaces where you want the player to go, where you want the attention of the player to go, have been lit up where everything else, is very poorly lit and, I guess I should say more dimly lit. And the brighter areas naturally just jump out at the player and catch their attention. So that's one way, just one small way, about how lighting your scene can be very, very, very important. And you can see, in the final art over here on the right that, that doorway on the scaffolding is, being lit by this really cool spotlight, and they threw a bunch of really cool effects on it, and it just very naturally pops out at you because you can actually see it. So, so yeah, I guess one of the last tips that I can leave you with is never focus on perfection. Focus on good enough. Because if you focus on perfection, you're never going to finish. And you're gonna see this all the time in your professional work. If you're on a project, you're never ever going to have infinite time, budget, and resources. You're just not. So you need to learn to work quickly, work iteratively, and know when to put something down or to stop working on an area. Because good enough is the enemy of perfection, but perfection is the enemy of done. And you want done every single time. Yes, the finished product might fall short of what you wanted, but you're going to learn from that experience. You're going to get better. You're going to build skills as you keep building and finishing. So it's really important to, enforce deadlines, enforce some kind of constraint, be it on yourself or externally through something else, and work within that time frame and just focus on finishing. And you can break it down into small tasks, like, maybe, the first week you want to get all of the initial sketching and planning done, and then the second week you want to block it all out in a level editor, and then the third week you want to script all the gameplay sequences and make sure that's good, and then, the next week you play test it, make sure, it's bug free, all that stuff. And then in the next week you start doing the art pass, and then, finally in, like, I don't know, the 6th or the 7th week you focus on polishing everything up and making sure everything there is done. And after that 7th week, you never go back and, start fine-tuning things because you think things could be a little bit better or it could be perfect. That is how you're going to just spiral and never finish anything. And it's much more important to finish than focus on perfection. So, how and where do you get started? Go to game jams, wink wink. Luckily, you're part of if you're attending this, you are you're attending a game dev meeting, and the Memphis game developers, us, we host game jams all the time. So if you just want to get some more practice in and, focus on doing things on a time frame where you have to have a deliverable, like in a weekend, a game jam is a great place to do it. And it's a great place to, really kind of like just focus and, learn new things and, network and just do a bunch of really cool things. I understand, there's also a pandemic, so you might not want to go meet up with a bunch of people. So there are modding communities online. You can find forums, which are a little less popular these days, or discords. But again, I want to point out to be very careful about which communities you join, because some don't really focus on gameplay, like the Gary's Mod example that I gave earlier. If you want to focus on gameplay, find a community that does that. And I would honestly kind of point you away from like Unreal and Unity, because those communities tend to be a little more focused on like programming and stuff like that. They don't necessarily focus on the game or level design aspect of things. But yeah, so really it's just, start practicing in your free time. Start building things in your free time. I've got a bunch of references and stuff that I'll show you after this, but really it's just, if you want to do it, just start, just pick it up. Again, don't worry about perfection, just start building, and the more you do it, the better you will get, and you will build your skills as you keep going. So yeah. So where can I start? These are amazing games that would be a really great place to start. The gameplay is already built for you, the mechanics are already built for you, and the games have level editors built inside of the game. You don't have to worry about tools, you don't have to worry about building a development environment, you can just focus purely on level design. Portal 2 is great, it's older, so you can find it on sale all the time, it's super cheap. Mario Maker is quite literally a level editor disguised as a game, and you have all of the mechanics from a lot of the old school Mario games to play with. So that is a great place to start. Hopefully there are no kids here. I don't think there are. Doom and Proteus, those are amazing games on their own, but they also come packaged with level design tools. And to be clear, that is Doom 2016. Doom Eternal did not have a level editor with it. And then Proteus is actually made partly by one guy here in town, Jason Mojica. It's a great game. You should totally go pick it up. The gameplay itself is really good, but part of the main menu is a level editor that is really well made. And again, you can just focus on building your gameplay spaces, and filling them with like mechanics and combat and gameplay that you want, and you don't have to focus about building the game or the combat or the mechanics, because it's already there for you. You can focus purely on just building your level. And then if you want to get a little more into the woods, here's some external level editors. Again, you can use Unity and Unreal, but I encourage you maybe not to start there, because it's very easy to kind of like get into the woods and focus on building like a mechanic or a system instead of like a level. So what you might be able to do there is go to the marketplace for either engine and find, I don't know, like a game template, like a game that's game rules that have already been built for you, and then just build something with that template. Of course, you have good old pencil and paper, which is another, again, a great place to start. It's a great brainstorming thing. If you have ideas, just jot it down and, think about how that might play out spatially. And then on the bottom, again, I would be careful if you go this route because both of these tools are much older. But Hammer, that is the, sorry, I jumped a slide, but Hammer is, it's an older kind of like source engine tool. Honestly, it's like really deprecated and it's really complicated to set up if you're not familiar with it. And the interface is really intimidating when you first open it. So I would encourage you to not start there. Also, Radiant, it's what the Call of Duty games for some reason still use. And honestly, it's even worse than Hammer in terms of like the intimidation factor. And it's just more complicated, and you have to own those games to even build content for them. And they exist. But if you want to build content for, I don't know, like Half-Life 2 or like one of the Call of Duties, that might be a good place to start. But I encourage you to start with like Portal 2 or Mario Maker or Doom 2016 or Proteus, because again, you can just focus purely on building your level around gameplay that's already there for you. You don't have to focus on the gameplay itself. And plus, Hammer and Radiant, the scripting in those editors is rough around the edges, and I'll just leave it at that. So, yeah, that's basically most of my talk. Hopefully it was useful. If you want to dive deeper into this, again, each one of these slides could have been its own hour-long talk, but I had a lot to cover, so I tried to keep it as high level as best as I could. On the architecture side of things, these are amazing resources. I've read each one of these. They're great. They're beautiful. I do have to say, Design of Everyday Things is not about architecture. I got ahead of myself there. That's generally a high-level design book, just in its entirety. It is an amazing resource. I will say, though, the first chapter will introduce you to this idea of a Norman door, and once you know what a Norman door is, you're never going to be able to unsee it. You're going to see them everywhere in real life, and they're going to make you angry. But no, on the architecture side of things, there is 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School, which is not necessarily like a book or like a manual. It's like each page is its own self-contained idea, and it's really good to just like pick up, browse through, and just kind of like reflect on each page. I love it. I had, dang it, I keep jumping slides. One moment. Oops. Here we go. I had a designer from Insomniac Games recommend Architecture, Form, Space, and Order. I am still working my way through that one, but I've read most of it. And as far as websites, there is World of Level Design, which I've linked there. I'll also make these slides available after the talk, so all these links I have, you can click on those and actually go to the place. There is an amazing self-published book by Alex K. He's Tycho Bolt on Twitter, called Level Design and Pursuit of Better Levels, and he breaks things down even farther than I have here. And again, it's an amazing resource. There's also Robert Yang. I stole a couple of images from him. But the level design book, again, honestly, the level design book is probably my go-to these days. It is amazing. And then, of course, you can always do your own research, but again, vet your sources. And a good place to do that would be to, I don't know, go to the credits of your favorite game, and then, look for the designers, and then look for them, like, on LinkedIn or Twitter, because more often than not, they have a portfolio, and they love talking about what they do, and it's a great place to go and learn from, people in the industry. And I guess from there, I can open up to Q&A. Hopefully y'all learned something from that. Oh, wow. Oh, good. Hopefully it was helpful. Like I said, I didn't have a whole lot of time to prep, and there were a lot of big ideas there, and I feel like I could have gone a little, like, zoomed in a little more on a couple of them, but, I tried to keep it high level, so. Oh, thank you. But yeah, no, any questions or anything before I stop recording? No worries. I'll just stop the recording now. That way, we don't have to worry about it.